Merci. I will speak about the situation in Germany and how the relationship between church and state changed over the centuries. Because we started in the medieval times with a concept where the relationship between church and state was... In the medieval times, the relationship between church and state was seen as God-given, and all power was seen as God-given power. So we had, on the one side, the spiritual power seen as God-given, but also the worldly power seen as God-given. Okay, better now? But during the course of history, it changed. There was a lot of interference between state and church. In the time of dictatorship during the Nazi period, the state tried to occupy the churches for its own means. The state tried to install a bishop. And this bishop was supposed to say the same teachings as the National Socialist Party. In this time, theologians argued that it can't be that the church and state are so close and are so interchangeable. In a very famous confession they said, "We reject false doctrine as though the state, over and beyond its special commission, should and could become the single totalitarian order of human life, doing so fulfilling the church's vocation as well. We also reject the false doctrine as though the church, over and beyond its special commission, should and could appropriate the characteristics, the tasks, and the dignity of state, though becoming an organ of the state." This shows that we had many changes in our history of the relationship between church and state. I want to talk about the relationship of our modern days, how church and state in Germany are working together today. The legal foundation for this can be found in our constitution, which gives religious freedom to all people. Religious freedom has different meanings. At first, it's universal, so all people are free to choose their religion. It is a positive freedom. On inner and outer affairs, a person can believe what he or she wants to believe, and he or she can act upon it. But it's also a negative freedom. A person can change his or her religion. A person can also give up his or her religion. These are the important aspects of religious freedom, and these are instituted by our constitution. Our constitution also holds for the separation of state and church. It's an agreement of peaceful separation, different from the French model. It says, though church and state are separate, they can cooperate on certain issues. There is no state church, our constitution says. And the state needs to be neutral to all religions. It cannot favor a certain religion, it cannot hold a certain religion as a special religion. But the neutral state is also not allowed to answer religious questions. Whenever there is something in our public sphere going on religiously, the religious community has to be in charge of it, not the state, because there shouldn't be any more interference. We don't have the concept of laicism. Our concept can be better described as laicity. And there's a fundamental difference. Whereas laicism says religion should not be shown in public, where some laicists even go so far and say you cannot wear a headscarf in public, you cannot wear religious expressions, you cannot wear any symbols. We say, no, religion can be a public matter, but it has to come by the people, not by the state. It also can come by the mosque, by the synagogue, by the church, but it can only come by the religious communities, not by the state itself. We believe in a very strong civil society, because a civil society is good against a totalitarian state. And a civil society is made up of many different groups, labor unions, but also churches, religious groups like the Muslim communities, Jewish communities, and people of other faiths or people without faith who organize themselves. I want to give you 3 short examples on how this is possible in Germany and how things are done. First, there is religious education in all public schools in almost all of the 16 states of Germany. Religious education is taught, and it's taught in charge of the religious communities. It's not a privilege just of the churches. Amongst others, like math or German. But it's not taught by the state, because the state has to be neutral towards religion. It's a cooperation between the church and the state, or the Muslim communities and the state. This is also seen as a cultural affair, because our state holds the view that it is important to have values, that it's also important to have religious values, but what these values are cannot be stated by the state. For a long time, the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church are teaching religious education in schools. Since the 1960s, more and more Muslim people are moving to Germany and are living and working in Germany. Their children also want to have the possibility to have Muslim religious education in public schools. Therefore, some states already started a program where university-educated teachers can teach Muslim religious education in schools. It has to be made sure, as for Protestant and Catholic religious education, that this is not meant to be missionizing or convincing students of certain views, but to educate. Scientific views have to be held. There has to be a critical reception of sacred texts. There also has to be a historical perception of those texts. All people who teach need to be educated in public universities. The focus is given on reflection and discussion of religious values. There's 2 other topics which are very prevalent within the right of religious communities. In 2010, the protection of animal rights was made part of our constitution. This sounded very good and perfect to all the people, but then there was a difficulty with religious slaughtering. It was a difficulty that some courts argued it cannot be done anymore. But at the same time, there is people depending on religiously slaughtered meat. So the final decision was that it is illegal to have religious slaughtering, but there can be exceptions for certain reasons, like for religious communities who are depending on this meat. This also shows how our concept works. There is a strict separation, but at the same time, it's a very pragmatical cooperation at certain issues. A much further and a much bigger discussion arose last year about the circumcision of male infants, because a local court argued it's against. Okay, so there was a big discussion about the circumcision, and when the circumcision law is. No. But it's only 1 minute. So it altogether shows religion is a public matter, but it needs to be done by the people, not by the state. The churches, the people, and the religious communities are important for society, but the separation of state and church is also a big thing that all religious community can prosper from. Thank you very much.
Ensuite, il y a un grand entre les mains des communautés religieuses et pas de l'État.